While we're waiting here, it is 1 o'clock spot on. Want to give just a few more moments since we did have a really good show here. My name is Harris Rosensweig, the Director of Accessibility for TCS Access, broadcasting live from our offices in Silver Spring, Maryland. Just a little bit of housekeeping. I'll go over it again. If you're not a full-time Zoom user, we have our chat window. Alt-H is the hotkey to get there. If you would like to speak and unmute your microphone, Alt and A for audio. If you would like to turn your video on or off, it's Alt-V for video. So those are the main ones. Alt-H to go to the chat window. If you'd like to type in a question there, it would show up for everyone. And Alt-A to unmute yourself, and Alt-V for video. It's going to give it another moment or two, let people catch up. Log in. And Carolyn, everything okay on the captioning side? Turned on.
Yes, it is. I have myself muted in 2 spots, so yes, everything's good.
Thank you very much.
People just have to turn it on at the bottom of the screen. There's a button for closed captioning.
That's right. If you want to see the closed captions, there is a closed caption button, and you can click on the show subtitles, and you can actually adjust the size of the subtitles as well. See, how many folks do we have? We have 22 right now. Another interesting one I found is Alt-Y to raise your hand. That's another good keystroke. Got one more here. Anyone from Philadelphia area? That's where I hail from. Can you write in the chat box? Yeah. My colleague Jeff Ermold, who's the Director of Training, he's from Philly as well. Okay, I'll give it just one more minute. Thank you everyone for your patience. And then we'll get started with our topic today. Maybe I'll just go into my opening spiel here. I want to welcome everyone. Good afternoon. Again, my name is Harris Rosensweig. I'm the Director of Accessibility for TCS Access. We've been around since the 1980s. I've been here at this wonderful organization for the past 10 years. And we are dedicated to the advancement of equal access for persons with disabilities, whether it's in the enterprise, in the education environment, or one-on-one at home. We're proud to be hosting this webinar, this very important webinar, Voting Blind: Promises, Challenges, and Opportunities of the 2020 Voting Experience. This webinar is part of a series that we're putting out on accessibility in this 30th anniversary of the ADA. Some of our webinars are more technically oriented, whether they be accessibility of Microsoft Office or the G Suite or PDFs or web accessibility, and others center around the accessibility of the enterprise, whether in the public or private sector, including one we did last week entitled Supporting Employees with Disabilities in the Enterprise to ensure that they have equal access to virtual meetings and to training on their assistive technology. Others will like the one we're doing today on general accessibility issues for the disability community. So we want to hear from you today. You're an important component to this webinar, and stay tuned to other webinars we have planned. Excuse me, I'm just gonna admit this person. Okay, so as I said, so the housekeeping, we do have real-time captioning going on. You can turn on your subtitles via the caption button. Again, Alt-H for the chat box. We are going to give a few short pauses to allow people to chime in either through the chat box or through your own voice. Alt-A to unmute yourself, Alt-V again to turn your video on and off. We do want to hear from you. There'll be a transcript and recording available after the webinar, and there'll be information at the very end on who to email. So let's begin. I have some introductory remarks, and then we'll get right into our guests. So voting is a fundamental right of all Americans. Federal law states that all persons have the right to vote privately and independently. And we're all seeing what some of the challenges are going to be in November, having just gone through them in the primaries, either trying to vote in person or by absentee ballot. As we see, there is no lessening of the COVID crisis in its first wave, and there's a potential to have even a second wave of this virus. Simultaneously, there's also a great concern around election security, both at the polling place and if states decide to implement large-scale use of absentee ballots. As we'll discuss, these challenges weigh very heavily on persons with visual impairment and the need for a safe and accessible way to vote either in person or by absentee ballot. So today, with the help of our two guests, we'll be giving you some valuable information in 4 different areas. So we have the challenges COVID-19 has made to elections and the impact for persons who are blind, various initiatives states are undertaking around accessible voting, especially around absentee ballots, and some commentary on the experience of our panelists in just held primaries in Virginia and Washington, D.C., and finally, challenges as we approach the November election and beyond. So I'd like to introduce our guests. First, we have Jim Dickson, who is the former Vice President for Organizing and Civic Engagement of the American Association of People with Disabilities, AAPD, and Clark Rachfal, American Council of the Blind's Director of Advocacy and Governmental Affairs. Thanks to both of you for talking with us today. A few background statistics as we wind up into the webinar itself. I did some research prior to the webinar, and a lot of these statistics that I got are thanks to the great work of this virtual conference that I attended, sponsored by AAPD and the Rev Up campaign called Power the Disability Vote. I strongly recommend, if you're interested in this topic, that you tune in. They have the recordings of both days of the event, and it's excellent. It's a lot of good material. So the statistics were presented by a team of professors at Rutgers, Lisa Schur and Douglas Cruz, and they mentioned in 2016 there were 35.4 million voters with disabilities. In addition, 27.3 million live in a household with a person with disability. So we're talking about quite a significant voting block here. This is enough to turn just about any election. I can't think of a more important election than the one we have coming up. That said, only 56%, they say, of persons with disabilities actually vote. And that figure goes down to 53.7% for persons with visual impairment, as compared with 62% for persons without disabilities. So nothing great to shake a stick at there. So they did give us a slide on why there is such a disparity, but I wanted to ask our panelists right out of the gate why they thought of such a disparity. So Jim, I'm going to start with you. I have a 2-part question. One is, first, can you first talk about the organizations that you are working with on accessibility of voting and how the two of you and Clark, are collaborating? And second, can you provide some insights into why you believe there is low voter turnout? So Jim, if you'll get us started.
Okay. Hello, everybody. NICL, the National Council on Independent Living, we're the Organization for Independent Living Centers, along with the American Council of the Blind and a dozen other national organizations, have created the Accessible Vote Coalition. Our mission is to improve accessibility of voting, and that no matter how you choose to vote, whether it's in the polling place or by mail, that the experience is accessible, easy, efficient, secure, and safe. Maybe Clark wants to say something, because Clark, you just had a little victory yesterday.
Yeah, thank you, Jim, and Harris, thank you for organizing this webinar today. So as Harris stated, my name is Clark Rachfal. I'm the Director of Advocacy and Governmental Affairs for the American Council of the Blind, or ACB, which is a national grassroots membership organization of people who are blind and visually impaired throughout the United States. So as Jim mentioned, we're working collaboratively with NICL as well as many other national organizations to improve voting access throughout the entire voting process. So whether that's voter registration, in-person voting at the polling location, or remote absentee voting, which is all the rage in 2020 due to the coronavirus and COVID-19. So as Jim alluded to, we're working on this issue on many fronts, whether that's on national policy initiatives with Congress, but also voting is local. So many of our state affiliates and their members are working to impact voting access within their own states. And as Jim mentioned, we just got some good news out of the state of Florida yesterday, where the Florida Council of the Blind has a legal proceeding pending against the state, and the state moved fairly quickly to certify a an accessible remote absentee ballot tool.
That is very exciting to hear, Clark. And I absolutely want to drill down into the issues, the state initiatives, and the issues around the accessibility of the absentee voting process. If you, maybe Jim, go back to you, comment on some overarching issues you might see as to why there is a low voter turnout. I do want to return to the specifics of the polling station and the absentee ballot, but maybe some high-level overarching issues. Why do you think there is such low voter turnout amongst persons with low vision and blind?
I think it's a complicated set of reasons.
Mm-hmm.
The accessibility of voting is relatively new, 18 years. The equipment is getting better, but it can be cumbersome. I think another big reason is that candidates don't speak to the issues of blind and low vision people. We don't have blind and low vision people running for office.
Mm.
That whole set, put it together with what we know that affects low voter turnout across all groups: lower education, lack of employment. It is absolutely clear that if you work, you are much more likely to vote. And as we know, unfortunately, the overwhelming majority of blind and low vision people are not working.
Mm.
So I don't think there's any one thing we can point to other than to say that the poverty, isolation, low self-esteem that those two things generate are all factors in low voter turnout. And I will just end that it's those of us who are blind or have low vision, we have to talk to everybody we know in our families and who have similar visual impairments about the importance of voting. The most important factor in getting somebody from the non-voting to the voting category is when somebody you know and trust talks to you about voting and encourages you to vote. That is the most important way to move people into becoming voters. So talk to those you know who also have visual impairments.
Thanks for that, Jim. Clark, would you like to add anything to that, what Jim was saying?
Absolutely. So as Jim mentioned, voting accessibility has really picked up in the past 18 years. That was with the passage of the Help America Vote Act in 2002. And that requires there to be an accessible ballot marking device at all in-person polling locations, right? But in 2017, there was a Government Accountability Office study that showed that not all polling places are meeting that requirement. You know, I believe it was, I don't want to misquote the statistics, but I believe it was around 50 or 60%.
Yes.
Only had accessible ballot marking devices. So we still have some way to go for accessible voting in person. And that's if you can already overcome the other systemic barriers that Jim mentioned, in addition to transportation, which is a major barrier for people who are blind and visually impaired to make it to the polling location. We also have the issue of voter registration. Fortunately, there's been the National Voter Registration Act, or the Motor Voter Act, requiring places that provide disability support services to assist with voter registration. But how can we encourage places to do that on a more regular basis? You know, sure, they do it when you first walk in the door, but is there reoccurring outreach there? And how can we promote that to really drive home how important it is? And in addition to voting, I think it's also important to recognize that the 2020 census is ongoing. So in addition to casting your vote in primary and general elections, it's also important to ensure that people who are blind and visually impaired are counted and represented when federal dollars are being doled out to state and local jurisdictions, as well as for support programs. We want to make sure that those in our community are counted and represented. So in addition to this conversation, I really want to encourage everyone, if you haven't done so already, to go to 2020census.gov and register in the census.
Thank you for that, Clark. So it's clear it's not just a technology issue. It's not just an accessibility of technology issue here. There's so many more factors: self-esteem, education, employment, voter registration. It is a multifaceted issue. I do want to hear from the participants in a moment. I do want to turn our attention. You did mention the polling place to that specific area. The experience of voting in the polling station, and what are the things that are supposed to be in place to ensure accessibility? Maybe I'll bounce back to Jim if you want to chat about that a little bit. What's supposed to be in place?
Every polling place is supposed to have at least one accessible ballot marking device. A computer, a touch screen that has audio output that can magnify the screen, and the voter can privately go through the ballot, I'm totally blind, so I use earphones. Mark the ballot, review the ballot. The accessible voting device prints out a ballot that is then put either in a ballot box or into a machine that counts the ballots.
Okay.
There are a number, depending on where you live, there'll be a different machine. The counties buy them and pick out what they want. Some are easier to use than others. One of the problems that we run into is that election poll workers sometimes don't already have the machine set up, don't know how to run it. I once ran into, the machine was set up and turned on, but they couldn't find the earphones. I always bring earbuds in my pocket so that I can use my own earbuds if there are not earphones.
Clark, anything to add to that as far as what to expect, and maybe suppose I'm blind and I get there and they have no such device. What can I do?
We do hear about that. So my advice would be, if you arrive at a polling, I guess to back up. So in addition to having accessible ballot marking devices, polling places need to be physically accessible. The polling place workers need to be knowledgeable and trained on the accessible ballot marking device. As Jim mentioned, we always have the scenarios where they're not as well trained as we would like, or that would make for an efficient process. But also it's important for the boards of elections to communicate what accessible voting options there are. And most commonly that's done via the websites. If you arrive at a polling location and either the accessible ballot marking device is broken or it's unable to be used for whatever reason, I recommend contacting your local, or local to your state, your protection and advocacy agency. There's one in each of the states, as well as the District of Columbia and the territories, and they keep track of polling place accessibility. So I think that would be a great resource for folks to begin with. And their national trade association is NDRN. And if you go to ndrn.org, that's a quick and easy way to access the P&A for your local state. And on this topic, I'd also like to add that we recognize, as Jim mentioned, we have an accessible ballot marking device in the polling location because it's understood and clear that people who are blind and visually impaired cannot read or independently complete a print paper ballot. But however, once we leave the polling location and we move to absentee voting, no one waves a magic wand. We're not all of a sudden cured of our visual impairment or our blindness.
Mm-hmm.
So we really need to have an accessible way to vote remote absentee as well, just like we do at the polling location.
Jim, did you want to say something? I'll just add to that. We will have a set of resources. We'll have a slide in our PowerPoint, which we can send out to you, which will have a whole bunch of resources to kind of encapsulate what Clark and Jim have been relaying to us. I wanted to ask Jim about the effect of COVID. I certainly didn't want to go to my election polling place during the primaries. Talk about what is the effect that COVID has had on this as well, specifically at the polling station.
Yeah. All across the country, states, in response to COVID, most states have made it much more easy to vote a mail-in ballot. It used to be to vote by mail, you had to be sick or get an excuse or be out of state. That is changing. There are estimates that run that say between 50 and maybe 65% of all ballots cast in November will be mail-in. Each state sets the rules for how mail-in works. In some states, if you're registered to vote, you get the ballot in the mail, period. In other states, they will mail you an application, paper application, that you have to fill out, send in, and they will then mail you a paper ballot. In some places, you have to request the application for a paper ballot. But we know from the primaries and from very recent changes in state law that something in the neighborhood of 6 out of 10 people will be voting by mail this November. And mail-in ballot, for those of us with visual impairments, means we lose our right to a secret ballot.
Yes, and I do get to that topic of the absentee ballot and how accessible that is in a moment. I do want to.
Let me just add one other thing that I think is important for everybody to know. Because so many people for the first time will be voting mail-in, we are probably not going to know the winner of the election on election night the way we're used to. It takes a lot longer to count paper mail-in ballots. There are procedures for voter verification, and I think it is probable that it could be days before we will actually know who has won.
Undoubtedly.
That isn't to say that there's cheating or stealing or stuff going on. It's just that counting millions of paper ballots is a slow process. You have to do it accurately. You have to be secure about it. So it's important that we all can adjust our expectations about when we're going to know the results of the election.
Clark, any final comments before we go to the participants regarding their experience at the polling station?
Sure. To add on to what Jim has previously stated, in voting and elsewhere, I think it's interesting how the rest of the world is adopting tools and techniques that have been used by people with disabilities as, frankly, as reasonable accommodations. Look how quickly everyone has moved to remote work and done so with tools that the disability community has been using for quite some time. And look how quickly, and rightly so, many states have moved to expanding remote absentee voting, in doing so by telling their citizens to check the box that is used by voters with disabilities or seniors, because it's been such a good tool for many folks with disabilities, people who are blind excluded, for quite some time. So let's open that up to everyone else. But as I previously stated, and as Jim mentioned, in most cases, this means receiving a standard small print paper ballot, needing to complete it and return it by mail. So that's really where the hardship comes in. And just like in the polling location, we really need to work to ensure that the remote absentee voting process has accessible means of voting privately, independently as well.
Yes, this is an incredible hot topic with voting, the accessibility of that, and that is my very next topic. I promise you I want to drill down into that. I am a digital accessibility geek, and I love talking about things like that. So just to wrap up on the polling, I read the statistic, the GAO study that showed in the 2016 election, 60% of polling places had one or more potential impediments to voting. And then the Rutgers survey in 2012 showed that 30% of voters with disabilities reported problems with voting in the polling place. One quick comment from the chat box from Francie. I'm a poll worker, and we're trained that we can assist people to fill out paper ballots. 2 of us, Republican and Democrat, will be assigned to help the voter. Oh, that's good. Finally, you have them working together. I'd like to provide
Harris, may I comment on that?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
I would say that that's a great accommodation for the folks who would like assistance. But again, the law requires independence, and requiring all voters who are blind or visually impaired to use assistance from poll workers, I'd say violates that right to independence. So if that's the choice that the individual would like to make and the accommodation they would like to use, great. But I would not say it should not be the only accommodation available if individuals do not want to give up their right to a private, secret, and independent ballot.
That's an excellent point, Clark. That actually should be the of last resort. The solution of last resort is that you have human intervention to help you, because then, as you say, it's not going to be private. So I completely agree there. I'd like to give our participants a chance to unmute and chime in on what are the issues you see either at the polling station or in general as to why there's low voter turnout, and then we'll go on to absentee ballots. So if you want to unmute yourself, it's Alt-A as an apple. We'll unmute your audio if you want to chime in. I'll just give us a moment. Coming up, we'll be talking about maybe some state initiatives that are going on as we start to turn our attention to the all-important absentee ballot.
Harris, this is Doug Pell, and I just wanted to say I was talking with a friend of mine, a sighted friend of mine, and she had actually requested an absentee ballot for the primary and never got one. So this is, obviously we're focused on trying to get them, the disability side of it, the disability issues, but we're also fighting against a system that hasn't really worked out how they're going to even even service service anybody.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I voted absentee ballot myself, and I had to email 2 or 3 times because I was getting nervous because I wasn't receiving anything. Thank you, Doug. Give another moment that someone else would like to chime in.
Yeah, Mike Godino.
Hello, this is Regina from Sacramento, California.
Oh, sorry, we had 2 people at the same time. Regina, or was it Mike?
I don't know, whatever. Regina can go, I'll go with her.
Thank you. I wanted to share with you that we've been working several years in California for accessible voting for people that are blind that's also independent. And it's not the most, some people still are upset because there's paper ballots involved, but what they've done is they mail a ballot to everybody anyway in California. And what they do is they put 2 holes on the outside of the envelope, and that way it's identifiable, but also they send, you request the email on the website, and they give you an emailed ballot. You fill that out on your computer independently, privately on your own computer, and then you print it out. You then put it in the envelope, and where those 2 holes are, that's where you sign. The envelope is pre-addressed, and you don't have to do anything else but sign it. And you can put it in any mailbox or drop box for the voting. So theoretically, you could do this all by yourself at your own home and get it ready and mailed and signed. And I just wanted to let you know that there are ways to do that and still preserve the paper ballot, because at this time, the paper ballot is rather essential to a lot of people feeling the election is secure.
Mhm.
Anyway.
Thank you for that, Regina. It is 1:36, and there seems to be a lot of interest in this issue of the absentee ballot. So I think I'm going to roll right into that. States are looking to implement in anticipation of what might be an election with COVID still very active in the population. The CARES Act, which you may have heard of, starting with the COVID assistance, provided an extra $400 million to states for the Help America Vote Act, HAVA, activities, some of which include funding of absentee ballot initiatives. And I'm just going to jump in, Clark. I know you and Jim have been doing a lot of work around state initiatives concerning absentee ballots and their accessibility. Can you give us just like a high-level overview of what some of these initiatives are, and really, what's at stake here?
Sure, and I'd say what's at stake is equal access to the polls for all voters with disabilities. So I believe it was Regina from California touched on the system they're using in California, and we thank her for the efforts being done in California as well as many other states. And much like all other reasonable accommodations, voting is not a one-size-fits-all solution. So where somebody who's blind or visually impaired, as long as they have access to a computer and assistive technology, that would likely be a reasonable accommodation for them. However, somebody with mobility or dexterity impairments may have additional issues when trying to vote remotely and still needing to use a paper ballot. Mm-hmm. There are other states where the poll workers will bring the ballot marking device to the voter. And so in many other cases, the polling locations are remaining open as well as being, in some cases, being scaled back, but there still is access to the in-person polling location. In addition to the addition of curbside voting for folks who could use that as an accommodation. If they have a autoimmune or underlying medical conditions that they don't want to be exposed to the indoor environment of the polling location. Mm-hmm. And I'd say the more the better. If we can have a full catalog of voting solutions and voters are able to choose the one that best meets their needs, I think that would be the best way to provide access and encourage as many people as possible to vote. However, many states are rolling out paper ballot vote by mail exclusively. And that's really where ACB and other organizations are being active in this space. So whether that's filing ADA complaints to the Department of Justice or legal filings under Title II of the ADA and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, really demanding our civil rights to equal access to the process and to the voting experience. In some cases, it never even gets to that point because, for example, in the state of West Virginia, ACB and other organizations, Jim and Nickel were involved, and Disability Rights West Virginia was involved. And we worked with the Secretary of State and the House and Senate and Governor Justice to pass legislation that made voting access more accessible in the state of West Virginia. So it takes many flavors. Really what it comes down to is the boots on the ground doing the advocacy work. And if we're able to reach an amenable solution with the state that increases access to polling locations, then we never get to the later levels of the advocacy initiatives like we're now seeing in Idaho and Michigan, New York, Pennsylvania, Kansas, Florida, and others.
Thank you, Clark. Jim, I want to give you a chance to chime in on some of these initiatives, or if you want to have some general comments about the absentee ballot process.
Yes. First, generally, if a state goes to an all mail-in system, and we have Oregon, Washington, Hawaii, Utah, who are already, there are no polling places. Everybody does mail-in. That is much cheaper for a state to run. It requires, you don't have to recruit and train poll workers. So I think we are going to see more and more mail-in, even once we have a vaccine for COVID. Overseas, and let me say there are different flavors, as Clark said, for what accessible means when it comes to mail-in. First step is you receive the ballot on your laptop or phone, for those of us who have those accessible devices. You mark the ballot. You then print out a paper and you mail it in, as Regina was talking about in California. However, there are places in the country that for overseas military voters take it one step further. You mark it on your own device. It's then encrypted and securely emailed in. There are countries overseas that have been doing this for quite a while. In Estonia, right next to Russia, a country where in the last presidential election there, 40% of all votes were sent back electronically. It is possible to do this securely and accurately. I would just point out that Russia used to own Estonia. Estonia became free and independent when the Soviet Union fell. The Russians don't like the independence, and they have not been able to hack or manipulate the election results next door, where governments get reelected saying, we do not want to be part of Russia, we are an independent state.
Yes.
In Australia, there have been elections conducted totally by telephone. When there was a huge flood, 500-year flood in a province in Australia, everybody voted in by phone. It was secure, accurate, and safe. So there are technologies that would allow those of us who have our own accessible technology to mark and send in our votes privately and securely.
Excellent points, both of you. It blew my mind when I saw some things about voting via iPhone. The amount of information that are in the forms that one would need to create an accessible ballot, it's minuscule. but as many people have raised, there are these security concerns, which other countries seem to have addressed. I remember talking to you, Clark, before this webinar, and as mentioning that each state, is responsible for their own elections, and that they are starting to explore these online solutions for voting. And Clark, if you could comment on the challenges of that, if we have 50 states all looking at different solutions eventually, who's minding the store here? Can you comment on that, Clark?
Absolutely. So I guess first I'd like to say that we shouldn't hold remote absentee voting to a different standard, or electronic voting to a different standard than we do vote by mail or in-person voting.
Mm-hmm.
If we're waiting for a system that is 100% secure 100% of the time, I'd say don't hold your breath, because that does not exist. We don't have a 100% accessible system 100% of the time, and there's no such thing as a 100% secure system 100% of the time, even with paper ballot vote by mail or paper ballot in person. Look at Florida in 2000, what's going on in the 9th Congressional District in North Carolina, or even the primary held earlier this year in Wisconsin. We can pull up news story after news story about paper ballots not being counted, being declined because of erroneous claims about signatures not matching that disproportionately impact people of color or people with disabilities. So if we are going to wait for an electronic system that is 100% secure, that's never going to happen. What we should be asking is, how can we make a resilient system? How can we make our in-person, our vote by mail, and electronic absentee voting systems more resilient? And like Jim said, these are systems that are already being used internationally, as well as in some cases by states for their HAVA, their uniformed and overseas citizens who are voting, that allow for electronic ballot delivery, marking, and then fax or email return.
Thank you, Clark. We are running a little short on time. I have a few other things. I was curious. I want to know, did the two of you vote in the recent primary by absentee? And what was your experience?
Jim, would you like to go?
I voted, yeah, I was able to receive my ballot on my computer, mark it, review it privately and independently. The system was supposed to be that I could then print it out on my own. The system had a glitch. I could not do that. I had to have help. So I lost it to print out the piece of paper.
That's a good point.
Here indeed.
We had a Francie comment, what if I don't have a printer?
Mm-hmm.
Right. That is a problem. As Clark said earlier, we need multiple ways to vote in order to accommodate people. I think we ought to be able to electronically return the ballot, but there are many blind and low vision people who do not have either a smartphone or an accessible computer. And so we will need systems for those people to be able to vote privately and independently.
This is Chris Bell. I just wanted to say that I live in North Carolina, and we're the second most rural state in the country. And there are many places in North Carolina, as there are throughout the country, that don't have broadband internet access or any internet access. And we don't really have a good way of dealing with that, I think, unless you go the telephone route in terms of making easy access for people that live in rural areas.
It's a little hard to hear, but I think I grasped you're in North Carolina, and a lot of people don't have internet access.
Mhm.
It sounds like a huge problem
Yep.
there.
Yeah.
Yeah, again, I would say that there have been overseas efforts that have allowed people to use the telephone. That's more accessible. I'm sure there are still some people who don't have phone service. But I think the point is that there needs to be multiple ways that one can cast a ballot, either electronically or in person, by phone. We need experimentation and testing so that we can develop a system that is as secure as possible and as accessible as possible. And that is going to require research and development money, and the Coalition of Accessible Voting Organizations is committed to getting Congress to put the money up that would address the need for research, development, and testing.
We have just a few more minutes. I'd like to open it up to the participants for a moment and then ask some concluding question of the two of you. If you want to unmute yourself, if you want to chime in. Absentee ballots, anything related to voting? I know I was doing.
This is Regina again, sorry.
Hi, Regina.
I just wanted to say, since one size doesn't fit all, in our particular Sacramento County, we've also done a situation where we have in-person voting that's also accessible and able to be done independently, provided they have the machine up and going, and other things.
Thanks, Regina. And we've also heard that in California, as well as other states, the polling workers will bring accessible ballot marking devices to assisted living or congregate settings so that people can vote. However, when COVID, a lot of those systems have been scaled back or scrapped altogether as to not expose poll workers to the virus. I
would just say, in terms of this election, if you do not have a system where you can vote privately and independently remotely, every place in the country has early voting, meaning the polling places are going to be open not just on election day. It varies from state to state. And I would go and vote early. I wouldn't do it on the first day of early voting, and I wouldn't do it on the last day of early voting, because there are likely to be more lines there. But find out where the early voting locations are and plan to go in the middle of the day. Early voting is convenient, but for many of us, it means an added travel burden, because, for instance, here in DC, for a normal election, we have 400 plus local polling places, but for early voting, we've got about 24. Which means you've got to travel a lot farther to get to the early voting site.
Right.
Harris, this is Mike again. Maybe I'll try this time.
Yes.
All right, great. Jim, it's been a long time. I was up in New York a long time ago. I've been doing this since 2002, and it's been quite a journey. I've since moved to Virginia. And in New York, I advocated for the auto mark, and I kind of still have a bias toward that machine. I love it. However, now I'm in Virginia, and the machine that I voted on this past election, because I'm also a proponent of in-person voting, I really had an issue with, because I could not confirm the paper was voted properly. And I know a lot of the new voting machines that are being shown do not allow a blind voter to confirm that their paper ballot and or receipt is what they indeed voted for. So there's no confirmation of that paper receipt relative to what's being dropped in the machine.
Right, Mike, it's good to hear your voice again. The machines are different. LA has developed a machine that does allow a blind voter to independently confirm what is on the piece of paper after it is printed. There are other systems in development that allow that. It is, and it is important. Voting is not just a marking process. There is confirming, casting, and it is important that the ability to confirm what's on the paper be accessible.
Thank you. We just have a few minutes left here. I would like to just ask very briefly, Jim and Clark, maybe Clark start us off. What can the ordinary citizen do to foster efforts around voting accessibility and for they themselves to prepare for this upcoming election in spite of COVID?
Absolutely. So I'd recommend that everyone become educated on the issue. Fortunately, it sounds like we have many people on this call who are. Also, reach out to your broader community and your elected officials and create an awareness around this issue. Find out who else is working on these issues and collaborate with them. And then third, communicate what you're looking for in accessible voting and in the voting process in general. And come with, be able to outline and address the problems, but also come forward with solutions. And I'll just do a quick cheap plug. If you visit the ACB website, it's at acb.org/voting. There's some tools and resources there that can help get you started, as well as links to the Centers for Disease Control and the Election Assistance Commission that provides information about how to still vote safely and protect your health this year during COVID, especially if you are choosing to vote in person. So again, that's acb.org/voting.
And we'll have all these websites for you summarized in our PowerPoint and a Word document as well. Jim, if you'll comment on the same.
I would just repeat what Clark just said. It's important to talk to others, to talk in your community, both in the blindness, low vision world, but also in the broader disability community, and connect with your election office. And I would encourage that last piece, do that connection call to the election office in the next month or 6 weeks. Come middle of September, the election administrators are going to be extremely busy in setting up for this election. And so the best time to engage your local election official and give them feedback on your experience is do that now. Do it this summer before Labor Day.
Thank you so much to you, Jim and Clark, for a very interesting hour on voting accessibility. I have a slide up here with my details, Harris, Harris, at tcsaccess.com. Again, that's Harris at tcsaccess.com. If you want the PowerPoint materials and the recording, we can get that to you. This is Harris with TCS Access, Director of Accessibility, signing off. Thank you for your time and attention today.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much.